Well, thank you, Shepard. A beheading in Oklahoma still being treated as workplace violence. Why not a terrorist act? Welcome, everybody. I'm Neil Cavuto. Murder and other charges expected to be filed against one Alton Nolan. He's the 30-year-old accused of beheading a female worker at a food distribution center after trying to convert co-workers to Islam. It comes as we're getting word of another threatened beheading, this one at an Oklahoma City nursing home. Officials are trying to get to the bottom of all of it. To Garrett Tenney in Moore, Oklahoma, with the very latest. Garrett, what can you tell us?
Yeah, Neil, the separate incident comes on the heels of that horrific beheading, and it took place less than 20 miles away. On Friday, police arrested Jacob Mugambi Muithi after a co-worker told police that the man repeatedly told her he was going to kill her by cutting off her head with a blade, and then he was going to post it on Facebook. Muithi, who is a native of Kenya, is being held on a terrorism complaint in the Oklahoma County Jail. His bail is set at $1 million. Formal charges against him are expected to be brought later on today or tomorrow. Charges are also expected to be announced any time now against that man who brutally stabbed one of his co-workers, beheading her and then stabbing another woman until he was shot by an off-duty officer. The Moore Police Department is seeking charges of first-degree murder and assault with a deadly weapon against Alton Nolan, that 30-year-old man you mentioned, Neil. The FBI is also looking into this case to see if there is any links to terrorism related here in either case. Nolan, he converted to Islam earlier this year, and co-workers say he was also trying to get them to convert as well. He's expected to be released from the hospital later today or tomorrow and will be transferred to a prison until charges are announced. Neil.
Garrett, thank you very, very much. Well, ISIS threatened it. Now it looks like we might be getting it, or are we? Lone wolf style attacks cropping up after these ISIS beheading tapes. Again, or are they? Is there a connection? And are we prepared for it if there is? Let's ask former FBI agent, former Navy SEAL Jonathan Gilliam. Jonathan, it's interesting that the fellow who has been looked into for attempting, we're told, a beheading, is being looked at on terrorist issues, not so the guy who allegedly actually performed a beheading.
Well, I guess if you want to have effective terrorism in the United States, according to the Department of Justice, you just need to threaten it. But if you actually carry it out, it's going to be workplace violence or murder.
It's odd. Why do they do that? Obviously, a lot of it's meant to keep us calm, but it has quite the opposite effect.
Well, I think that's the meaning behind some of it, is to keep us calm. But I think after, I try to stay apolitical. I try to stay middle of the road as much as possible and just look at the facts when I come on TV. And after watching Obama last night on 60 Minutes, I just have to tell you, it's amateur hour. I mean, and it's infiltrated into the press releases by the DOJ. It's infiltrated into...
What's the amateur hour part? The way he's treating these incidents? The way he's responding to ISIS abroad? What?
The way he fights wars. The way he approaches the fight on terrorism. Whoever is telling him and briefing him on who these people are that we are at war with, and they declared war on us. It's not like we're declaring war on them. They declared it on us. This is a group that is bent on force. They're not bent on hearts and minds. You're not going to change the way they feel. And everything that he stated last night was, I don't know what world he lives in, but it's not this world. It's not the world that these jihadists come from.
Well, what are you saying about these attacks? Maybe it's addressing there's a reluctance on the part of this administration to link them to something more than what might be there. In other words, to treat them as just workplace violence and not take the extra leap that it could be something more sinister.
Well, I think they're hoping that it doesn't really progress here. And I think
what
that...
if it does?
Well, there's only going to be so many times they can call this workplace violence or murder before it it is really recognized as being terrorism. I mean,
we've had enough, as you pointed out, connect the dots. The shooting of this trooper in Pennsylvania, the Ali Akbar comments. I mean, there's enough to make you wonder.
The kid that was killed in New Jersey not
That's
even
right.
2 months ago, and that guy also killed 2 other people in Seattle.
Well, what's the fear? That we're going to go nuts? I mean, we're going nuts now.
That they're going to lose an election in November. That's what I believe it is. And, I would hate to think that, but this statement that this is workplace violence, and when you look at the definition of workplace violence versus terrorism, this murder fit the definition of terrorism almost it was perfectly. If you look at his background that he displayed on Facebook. If you look at the fact that he was a new religious zealot in Islam and was trying to convert people, then he goes back and does the exact same tactic. Neil, you have to remember that terrorism is a tactic. It's not a group, it's a tactic. And it is any act of violence or killing in order to change somebody's political views. That's what's happened here. That's what he did when he went in there.
What do you think the reaction would be? I wish we had more time, Jonathan, but if Americans who've seen these beheadings overseas thought, my God, it's happening here?
Well, I hope it doesn't get to the point that we have to end up taking arms ourselves and defending ourselves, but the fact is, police, as long as we allow people just to have as many children as they want in this country, and that's always going to be a right, police, there's just not going to be enough law enforcement. People need to be aware. I always say that on this show, but, you know, the world that you speak to, the economic world on this show, everybody needs to realize that we have to figure out a way to fire these politicians. And when people make comments like this is workplace violence when it was clearly a terrorist act, you know, that's not educating the public. That, to me, is malpractice in law enforcement. And
so you don't buy the extra caution kind of
It doesn't work. It doesn't
Gotcha.
work in any. It doesn't work in financing. It doesn't work in the real world. People need to be told what's going on, otherwise they can become a victim.
Well put, Jonathan Gilliam, the former FBI agent, former U.S. Navy SEAL. You do not mess with this gentleman. Meanwhile, despite this latest threat, the Justice Department is expected to issue a new policy for federal law enforcement banning all forms of profiling. It would prohibit undercover operations in places like mosques without proof of any criminal wrongdoing. And there would be no exemptions for national security investigations. Former FBI counterterrorism officer Steve Rogers thinks it's all a big old mistake. Steve, to Jonathan's point, we're sort of ignoring the obvious in the room here and afraid to state it for what it is.
As Jonathan said, this administration, Neil, is more concerned about being politically correct than the safety of the American people. Look, we're at war. Make no mistake about that. Why the President of the United States refuses to use that word is beyond comprehension. But I got to tell you.
Well, does that extend, Steve, just to be clear, to what people's religion? The President said do not base, but you know, on the Muslim religion, any sort of inquiries we make or patterns of investigations we hold.
Oh, look, I agree. There should be no racial profiling. But because we're at war, the rules of engagement for local law enforcement has changed, Neil. We need to profile. It's called criminal profiling. It's called behavioral profiling. Police officers don't wake up and target people because of their race, their religion, their color. But when there's enough evidence, intelligence information that the police have to lead you to certain areas where you have to criminally profile, we've got to do it, or I've got to tell you, we're going to see a lot of blood on the streets of this country, and I hope to God we never come to that.
What do you think of this one beheading, this other incident that could have been a beheading, some of these, you know, extremist-type attacks on a trooper in Pennsylvania, another man in New Jersey? I mean, it does look like a pattern.
Well, Neil, I'm concerned that they're saying, well, before we make that decision, we have to see if there's any links to terrorism. Neil, this is domestic terrorism at its worst. I mean, these individuals, look, you got Fort Hood, you got the kid in New Jersey, you got the beheading. Mostly, if not all of them, had some links to terrorist organizations via what? Social media. What is
so
ISIS
what is the fear, Steve?
I
know I asked this question 3 or 4 different ways. Then is the fear being that if we were to look at that and say we've got this sort of attack line in the United States, that that's any worse than a series of gruesome acts of domestic violence? I mean,
look, I think Jonathan nailed it, and it's sad. I think it's an election. It's an election year. They're concerned that things are going to get out of control. They're concerned about.
They already are.
Well,
they already are.
But in their eyes, you know, out of control with regard to an election. What we need to do is, and you said it, Neil, at the beginning of your program here, we need to tell the truth. The truth is we're at war, and this is domestic terrorism at its worst.
Well put, Steve Rogers. Thank you very, very much. Well, are we better off? The president says you better believe it. Why Pat Caddell says voters are not buying it. And chaos and clash is rocking Hong Kong. All eyes are on China's next move. Could we be looking at another Tiananmen Square?